I am very happy to be here in this shining summer morning in Stockholm. Thanks a lot to the organizers for allowing me to share with you some thoughts about what we are doing and the subject of our research about mobility systems and daily life in Latin American cities. So we focus a lot on streets because streets are everywhere. There are almost 80% of public space, according to Manuel Erce, and they are also 25 or 30% of the urban surface. So by itself, they are very important. Of course, parks and squares are public spaces too, but railways, motorways, which show that not every space is a place, and generally the rights of way. So vehicles, particularly public transportation vehicles, are part of the public realm. Stations, stops, rhythm, and also the virtual part, the mental representations of public space are important, and of course, how the city is organized. So we call about reclaiming the street for the city, because it's an element that shapes the city. It's makes it understandable and perceptible. It's the place where a lot of interaction and exchange takes place, as was perfectly illustrated yesterday. It's also a place for all flows, for water, stormwater, pipelines, etc. And also, it's the support of vegetal in the city, and the vegetable that allows wildlife with parks and squares wouldn't be enough alone. So it's also a membrane that divides the public and private sphere. And it has a lot of functions, but some ways of studying the street has narrowed the field a lot, and it takes only one dimension. Of course, circulation is one of the dimensions of the street, but sometimes it's a dimension that has changed everything. And it depends on which speed and which sort of circulation you are thinking about, that it will give you a street with more urban quality or not. So we studied that to each idea of a city, there is an idea of a street, and to each idea of a street, there is a model of environmental and energetic model. And the street is also the planning tool available everywhere. Some tools are very ambitious and important, but are not at the hands of some municipalities. The possibility of planning, designing, and managing the streets are always there. So the idea of the governance of planning as a monologue to planning as a dialogue, as a colleague from North America said. So if we go to Latin America, and we talk about streets in our perspective, we are a particular place where we are very urbanized and at the same time developing. We have a very dynamic society and economy, but also a very unequal society. And we are a creative continent, but also a recycler of ideas. Like Garcia Marquez said, quoting the Italian writer Giovanni Papini, that had infuriated his generation, of the grandparents of his generation, because he said that America was the waste and the disposal of European ideas. As he said the worst is that it was our fault. But he himself showed that you can be also creative, recycling that ideas and thinking about them differently. So this is part of a collective work about Latin American streets. And this synoptic shows you that we have almost 600 million people, 80% urban, 90% if you take Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, and some other countries too. We have 4 cities with more than 10 million people, 50 cities with more than 1 million, and more than 150 with more than 500,000. So we already talked about the importance of streets. And if we go fast through the ideas of the cities that shapes our streets, we have the colonial streets that survived, that were walkable, of course, but they are still vital, like this case in Santiago, like Florida in Buenos Aires, or like the Jirón de la Unión in Lima. And then you have another generation of streets in the centenaries of the Republic, where you have also pedestrian life, but you have public transportation, different ways of public transportation, a lot of pedestrians, shops, housing, commerce, etc. And this is a street that has a different speed, but it's still of very good urban quality. And you have examples in Mexico, in Paseo de la Reforma, and you have examples also in the most popular neighborhoods where streets are particularly vital, and that can correspond to each or other generation of streets. And then the integration of the landscape, like in those cases in Montevideo and La Habana, where at the beginning of the 20th century, the sea was not seen as a danger, but as part of the composition of the city. And then the single use of the street for one purpose of circulation, of car circulation, that sacrifices diversity. And still in this example, you can see other ways of transportation, railways and the urban environment. But it can be even more absorbing of other functions. Or when you don't have any more room, like in this case, you have a second floor of a motorway trying to sacrifice everything for circulation, twice in this case. So a later generation of streets in the late 20th century, like in this case, very well known in Curitiba, you have a street that has been designed since the beginning as part of the city planning with tying public transportation and urban density, and that has been taken in several other cities, but not always taking into account the complete idea from Curitiba. And it's very interesting that this is part of the answers in the mid-70s to looking for more efficiency in energy after the first oil crisis in Brazil. Another example in Bogotá, particularly successful in Avenida Jiménez, where the public space and the quality of public transportation go together. Some other cases, like our colleague Isabel Artiaga showed, you have the BRT, but not necessarily the quality of public space. And the same in Santiago. Rosana Forray also did a research about that. And you can, if you are taking into account the public space since the beginning, you can have a much better outcome of that. And again, the quality of the streets can be anywhere in any neighborhood. In this case, in Bogotá, the neighbors themselves called for an improvement of the street in their neighborhood. So we try to talk about the parallelism when some economic measurement at the beginning talk only about GDP, and then they move to Human Development Index and even Happiness Index to try to take into account other things. When we think about streets, we can have narrow concepts, or we can, of traffic engineering, or we can try to widen them up. So that is part of the challenge. And then trying to see how to reinvent the elements, we have seen that in the cities, the bikes have been rediscovered. Some cities have always been wise and never forgot their bikes, but other cities everywhere are taking the bikes in a new way of using them. The tramways were reinvented. BRT is part of the reinvention of the tramway. The phone has been reinvented, not by the phone makers, but the computer makers. They saw other opportunities in the smartphones. And the cars should be reinvented too. You have Autoliv in Paris and some sort of sharing the cars that can be part of the future. But a very first step is about how the interaction, the interface between public transportation networks and public space can improve the experience of traveling every day in Latin American cities. The bus is the most popular way of transportation, and usually they don't have any information for the people that are not used to it of how to move around the city. You have excellent maps in other cities, but in Latin American cities, public transportation is almost for a captive public, in theory. But the possibility of associating through the window the landscape that you are seeing during your travel and trying to find elements of design that can tie the public space to the way you are going around the city can change your mental map, as Kevin Lynch said, of the city. And that can also be applied to the subways and the combinations of different modes and to the neighborhood itself. And this case is from our colleague Joaquim Redig in Rio. he tries to also introduce the iconography of the city to the language of the representation of the public transportation. So this is a project that is particularly attractive for us because it's applied, it's being developed in the practice now in Buenos Aires, and we hope soon in other cities too. So just to finish, the idea also of the inclusive public space, the accessible public space, we have to think about each kind of circulation, but also the dark side of each kind of circulation and the conflict it may have with the city. And even with the BRT, which is a very important improvement, and as yesterday was said, a Latin American originated improvement, we can have a second generation improving the accessibility. It's better to have a motorway with priority for public transportation, but still, for the users, you have to walk a lot, climb, and go up and go down the stairs to go there. And even the most environmentally friendly of the means of transportation is the railway, and the one that has the less conflict with the city can be improved a lot if you think a little bit about how to interact with the city, like this case in Buenos Aires. So the idea of how bottom-up planning and top-down planning meet can sometimes be more or less soft or can be more or less a shock, like in this case in Santiago, when, at the beginning of Trans-Santiago, which was not enough explained to the people, the stakeholders were not so much present, and then they did a big effort to recover that and to improve that later. So how to think about the street, the metaphor of the agora, of the public space, as a place where public debate takes place, is also a very important part of the process, especially because our cities are mostly democratic, and the vocation of the citizens to participate is more and more present today. So thank you very much. I invite you, for those of you who want to have more information, to visit our website. Thank you.